The first photograph I'm going to speak about was when Dad had returned to the war, and we were now a family of six with four of us children. And the first photograph illustrates us in all our choir robes, me at the back in the adult choir with a black robe on, and Prudence, Deborah, and Sholto in choir robes for the junior choir. I think this illustrates two things about our family. First of all, we were brought up in the Christian faith, and St Barnabas Anglican Church was just down the road from us in Toohey Street. And though by the time we were four, we had moved to 16 Jackson's Road. So we had the fundamentals of the Christian faith according to the Anglican tradition. The other thing was that we were a very musical family, and one strong memory all of us have is after coming back from church and seeing our uncle and aunt and cousins at Papanui Road, we would gather round the piano and sing with, to Dad's in all our choir robes, me at the back in the adult choir with a black robe on, and Prudence, Deborah, and Sholto in choir robes for the junior choir. I think this illustrates two things about our family. First of all, we were brought up in the Christian faith, and St Barnabas Anglican Church was just down the road from us in Toohey Street. And though by the time we were four, we had moved to 16 Jackson's Road. So we had the fundamentals of the Christian faith according to the Anglican tradition. The other thing was that we were a very musical family, and one strong memory all of us have is after coming back from church and seeing our uncle and aunt and cousins at Papanui Road, we would gather round the piano and sing to Dad's accompaniment. Moving on to the next photograph, was when a time when we were teenagers, and our parents had taken us across to Western Australia to visit Mum's sister Auntie Nari and her husband Uncle Ivan, and we stayed in Western Australia, and Prue and Deborah picked up outfits from Australia, and Sholto had his New Zealand clothes on. And I particularly remember about the dress that I wore, because Mum was a very good dressmaker, and I was absolutely astonished. I was in the fabric store with her, and she zoomed to the bottom of the file and with unerring judgment picked up a beautiful cotton fabric with a black background and roses so realistic they looked as though they'd been painted on, and I wore it with a red cummerbund. Um, the next photograph I want to talk about is the main subject is Beryl Daisy Goff, who taught three of us girls singing, and Sholto until he got tired of her unpunctuality. But the wonderful thing about Beryl Goff was that she nurtured young voices and didn't force them, so she allowed them to grow uh, um, gradually and naturally. What I forgot to tell you earlier is that I was so excited when Dad said I could have singing lessons. This was at the age of 12, and this was particularly the foundation of my musical education. The next time we look at a photograph, had moved on to Wellington in 1964 to go and work and train at the National Library of New Zealand. And that was a time that was very fundamental in my young life. I was reluctant to leave home because it had been such a sheltering, happy, protective home. But I also, as a young person, wanted to try my wings in the world. And actually, when I went to Wellington, I was the only Pākehā in a Maori girls' hostel. I was a bit of an experiment. And after I left, I don't know whether they actually had a mixed Maori Pākehā hostel for women after that. At the National Library, I learnt the fundamentals of my craft and also sat exams for the New Zealand Library Certificate of the New Zealand Library Association, as it was called then. Unfortunately, I failed my final exams, but I was very kindly tutored by other librarians, particularly in cataloguing, in which I was weak, and passed the next year, at which time I was at the Reserve Bank and ready to finish. But during my time in Wellington, I had moved from Pendennis Hostel up to Kelburn, and at the time that I want to talk about the photograph, I was in a flat by myself in Upland Road, Kelburn, Wellington, opposite St Michael's Church. And there I met a lovely group of people, and the picture depicts three people from the St Michael's Bible Fellowship, which was Pam Labransky and Beryl and Brian Eggleston. The group was led by Joan Wood, who was the wife of Professor Freddie Wood, who was Professor of History at Victoria University. And that group went on for many years. We were about the same in number for that time. But between that time and the other person I need to speak about in Wellington at that time was my friend Elizabeth Crawford, who was bulimic and anorexic, very kind, and we often went out on expeditions together and had a lot of fun. Unfortunately, she was suffering a lot of pain through her bulimia, and at one stage she said, "I wish I could throw myself from the Kelburn Viaduct." She didn't commit suicide, but she died young, and I will always miss her. She was a great lover of cats and had many cat things. I went, between that time, I went overseas, did my overseas tripping around in England, Germany. I did a German course in Germany and went through France and Italy and worked as a mother's helper in Greece, and then returned to London, where I worked in the Science Museum library at one stage. And when there was a bomb scare in the Science Museum, although we were actually the Science Museum library was physically joined to Imperial College, we were also evacuated. I think that was the time of the IRA bombings and things like that. I returned to New Zealand, and one of the people I had made friends with in Wellington was Hugo Rusbridge. Actually, I discovered after I'd got to know him a while that he actually came from Christchurch too and went to Christchurch Boys High. Now, Hugo was a great lover of Wagner's music and introduced me to Wagner, for which I owe him thanks. And many years later, we tried to get to Bayreuth, and my sister Deborah tried to help me through her friend, the cultural director, Schleswig Holstein, but it was just impossible to get tickets to Bayreuth, so that never happened. And the next photograph uh, was Hugo's one and only marriage to a lovely English woman who was an agricultural researcher called Jill. Uh, 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 um, uh, Jill. Sorry, I can't remember her maiden name, but unfortunately that marriage didn't last, and she remarried and is now Jill Backus, and I've kept in touch with her. Hugo died about 18 months ago, and uh, and he came and saw me when he felt that his health was compromised. So I was very touched by that. Moving on to some very seminal people in my life in Wellington were my flatmates from Boundary Road in Kelburn. And I, first of all, Carol Crawford, and the photograph shows her and her husband. She became Carol Fuller, and she had an interesting career in the Department of Labour, and actually at one stage was Registrar of Trade Unions, among other things. And my beloved George knew Carol. He also worked at the Department of Labour, and said that Carol was being groomed for greater things, and a very able and intelligent woman. I was very fortunate with my roommate, who was Robin Raitt, and at the time we were flatting together, she was a junior lecturer in English at Vic, and it was her first year lecturing, and she is an expert and great lover of Shakespeare. I am particularly close to her at the moment, particularly after her husband Andy, a scientist with DSIR in the physics lab, died, and we are actually both in Ryman villages on the opposite sides of Wellington. I find her humanity and her intelligence and analytic skills to be incomparable, and and um, and her friendship I value very highly indeed. The next two people I want to talk about, and in particular the first one standing on the left side of the photo, George Braithwaite, my beloved. Now, George and I met at a forest and bird camp at Bushy Park in Wanganui, and we were standing together with tea towels in after lunch, drying dishes. And George told me about a limerick about an Australian who painted his bum like a dahlia, but the smell was a failure. And that was very typical of George. George had a limerick for every occasion, and he was very much into wordplay. In fact, he contributed often to the Listener, and sometimes got his witticisms published. George was not into commitment, that is a wedding ring, but and certainly not into babies. He was only interested in children when they're about 10 years old and could talk about computers or could play with computers. But we had a 44-year relationship, and he was my rock and stability for me during that time, particularly as I'm a schizophrenic. And when I was wobbly, one of the things I could do was ring him up, and he could come round and have a cup of coffee and and we could just relax and be together. So wherever I lived, George would come over on a Saturday night and go on Monday morning. But he was that anchor for me during that time, and particularly when I was learning to manage my schizophrenia. He he'd worked at many things. He was secretary at the Standards Institute in Wellington, and he um, also worked at the Department of Labour in charge of the accident statistics. And he was seconded, and, by the Woodhouse committee, along with a certain Geoffrey Palmer, to implement the ACC bill. So he had a responsible position. Ironically enough, he ended his career as a captain in the army, not because he wanted to be in the army, but because the Department of Labour was not moving forward computer-wise, and they were stuck with mainframes, and he wanted to work on desktops. But that was a very brief period, and he was certainly a very peaceful person. And he actually was a Methodist by upbringing, and when he first came to Wellington, he stayed in the church hostel adjacent to the historic Wesley Church in Taranaki Street in Wellington, and then moved into a flat with a number of other young men. Ironically enough, George had bad asthma, and he expected to be the first of the group to die, but he outlived them all to 93, in actual fact. And George and I did many things together. We went on overseas trips, and one of our best trips was to go and stay with a friend of mine and colleague of mine from MAF Fisheries, Ian West, a mathematician who was on contract to the University of Hawaii. And Ian very generously, we crossed over to the Big Island, and Ian drove us round that. So it was a fantastic trip, and we had quite a number of visits to Australia, which we enjoyed, and both Melbourne and Sydney. And George was a keen photographer, and I remember him taking photographs of the Sydney Opera House from every available angle, from the air, from the sea, from the foreshore, from Mrs. Macquarie's street chair, if I remember rightly. It was in the sights of his lens. I think we even went to the foot of the bridge and were able to look back, and George to take a photograph there. As you gather, being a forest and bird, he was a keen environmentalist, even at that stage, and some of his best photographs of wild things were published in a book on walkways in New Zealand, and his colour photographs were in the first edition of the Forest and Bird magazine, and he had an article in that first edition. So he was And he was also very musical and went to Recorded Music Society, and he introduced me to many contemporary music pieces and the wider repertoire and lesser known classical pieces. And for that, I owe him a debt of gratitude for extending my horizons. In the photograph is also Jodi Richardson. Now, she was an American, or is an American, she's still alive, and she worked for MAF Fisheries and was in charge of the freshwater database. Um, like me, with my knee at the moment, she's just had a knee operation. She's a very key tramper, like my sister Prue, and I've stayed at her lovely Victorian villa in Rotorua several times. She's a very good cook and a gracious hostess. The next photograph shows in the back row George. This is at my unit at 12A Byron Street, and next to him is Jean Olds, who was married to, was the partner of the Crantoby painter Paul Olds. Small world, but Mum nursed Paul Olds when he was a little boy and had scolded his face. Next to Jean was her current partner, Dennis Rose, the economist, who lives at Pai Kokoriki, and his funeral was just yesterday, on the 16th of February 2026. He had been an identity of the Pai Kokoriki community for 40 years, and the community at Pai Kokoriki, where Jean has also got a house, have gathered round Jean to mourn his passing. In the front row is myself, and next to me in the red jersey is Jenny Barnes. And Jenny was in an apartment block. I was in an apartment block higher up at the hill, with the side entranceway from Marshaback Street and also in Claremont Grove. And Jenny was down the hill in Brome Street in a block there. So we had a reasonable amount to do with each other, and Jenny was a very generous hostess to George and I. And Jenny and I have landed up in the same Rita Angus retirement village, Ryman Home, in Kilbirnie. Jenny went in before me. Her mother lived to 106 in Rita Angus, and Jenny had gone in before me, as she's had various health issues. The next photograph is of our mother, Lorna Jean Williams, née Best, holding her great-granddaughter, Sophia Fairbrass, as she was, and now Skellen, and her grandmother beside her, my sister Prue Fairbrass, and that was on the occasion of Sophia's christening in Motueka. The next photograph is my cousin Virginia Williams, known as Ginny Williams, who lives in Blenheim and grows grapes for delegates, and still working at almost 80, a workaholic, and but lots of fun, and we share quite a lot in common, being women who've never married but forged our own careers and managed our own lives to the best we could there. Ginny's always very hospitable, but always very busy, and I admire her energy. The next photograph is a man called John Kenyon, and he hails from Harrogate in Yorkshire, UK. And one of the reasons he came out to New Zealand was that when he was fighting in the war, he met New Zealand soldiers in Cairo, and uh, and when he considered a change in his life, um, he came out as an architect to the New Zealand Government Public Works, and was living um, in a flat leading up to Kelburn, was on the vestry of St Michael's Church, Kelburn, where I used to go. He was a very solid Yorkshireman, strong in his faith, and he loved the works of the Bronte sisters and was always quoting them, and particularly Anne's religious poetry. So I visited him and his wife when I went to a course at the British Library on Interloan, which was an international course, and he very kindly took me to Harworth, um, 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 uh, by the side of the moors where Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff, was portrayed as roaming, and took me to the vicarage where the Bronte sisters grew up and wrote their novels. And that was a very memorable experience for me. The next photograph is of my godson, Andrew Thompson, and I knew both his parents. Um, um, David Thompson was one of my set of friends. We played tennis together, often on our tennis court, or the Scarabs tennis court, and did things together while we were young people. And David became engaged to somebody I met at university, Leslie Cartwright. And when they married, I was one of Leslie's bridesmaids. Um, after that was in Christchurch, and after I moved to Wellington, I had stored some of my crockery with them, and they notified me they were going to Australia, so that they forwarded it to Mum. But I digress there. But sad to say, Leslie died on the operating table, and her two children were left motherless, Andrew and Sarah. And I remember them being sent to New Zealand after their mother had died, for a visit to their uncle and aunt and cousins in Kandala. And Sarah was obviously on the look for a mother. She sort of clung to me, and David was about 9 at the time. So I knitted a jersey for him and sent it to him, and which...
You mean Andrew was?
Andrew, sorry, Andrew, and Andrew there. Um, we Andrew married in Christchurch to Leonie, and they were for a while in London. They had a famous couch which accommodated many a Kiwi, and every visitor they came, they photographed, every Kiwi visitor came, they photographed them on this couch. And I was also photographed on this couch, though I wasn't staying with them. But they were very good to me, and I remember walking on Hampstead Heath with them, which was near their flat. And since then, they've returned to Christchurch and are living at St Martin's on Cashmere Hills. And I've watched their children grow up. Every birthday, I'd send the children something, and Andrew and Leonie would send them photographs of them opening my present, which was very touching. And now the children, Rose, the oldest, is down at the University of Otago, doing very well, and Hugh is at the University of Canterbury, also doing very well. And so it's been lovely to keep in touch with the family throughout the years when I come down to Christchurch. And they've been very accommodating of the fact that I'm not as spry as I used to be, and that I actually need to meet them on the flat rather than climbing their stairs. The next photograph is of the Reverend Dr. Raymond Pelly, who was my spiritual director for many, many years. In fact, when I was working at what MAF Fisheries became NIWA at Greta Point, I would go for spiritual direction during my lunch hour because he was just round in the next bay in Keogh Bay and climbed the zigzag path. Um, Raymond, the photograph is actually of Raymond in his anchorage. He had a room built at the bottom of his house which looked out over Evans Bay, and and that was where he did his thinking and praying and writing. He was the author of several spiritual books, and he gave retreats, which some of which I attended, and he was warden of the Anglican Training Centre, St John's College, at one stage. Now, Raymond saw me at my worst when I went to Franciscan retreat he was leading, and was so bad with my psychotic episodes that I was lying on the floor. And but he was also a very wise mentor and helpful in training me for the spiritual life, and also as a trainer, a priest himself. When I got my license for lay ministry, he was very helpful on sort of how to act in that role. And I at one stage, he had an office in St Paul's Cathedral on Molesworth Street, and I'd go to there to him for spiritual direction at one time when he was attached to the cathedral. But sadly, he has now got dementia, so we've had to move on from that. But he, once again, was an anchor for me in my faith and a guide to wider things. He spoke fluent German and often went to a convent in Germany where he went for spiritual growth and writing his books and renewing himself. The next person is Di Tracy. Now, the vivacious Vi Tracy was started as a technician in MAF Fisheries, but went on to scientific works. Now, she is very good at networking, so good that she networked and she mentored many female scientists, and she was so good that she had 2 awards for her ability to mentor and extend females in science. Just before she retired, she ran an international corals symposium, and since she has retired, she's become a scientist emeritus for NIWA, which means she has an office and a computer and the use of the facilities at NIWA, and has just recently returned from Beijing, where she was lecturing to marine science Chinese students. But she's also a lot of fun, and we still meet for lunch, and I've also asked her partner, who's a radio buff and very knowledgeable about it, from help from time to time about radios or about technical equipment. But Di has been very loyal to me, and I'm glad to know her because she brings a sparkle to everyone she meets. And in the last row of photographs is an elegant woman seated. Now, she is Mae Cairns, M-A-E Cairns. She was the widow of one of the moderators of the Presbyterian Church, a very sensitive and spiritual woman, and one of great depth and understanding. Sadly, she was very sensitively tuned, and she committed suicide, unfortunately. And whenever I go to Scorching Bay, I think of her because that's where her body was washed up. The next statue in the photograph was one that I had an idea for, a four-faced statue there, and I engaged an art student called Rahana Weaver, who did a mock-up. I forget what the term is for doing a pre-modeling of the model, and she and a friend came and put it in my garden at 12A Byron Street, where it still is. But George Whitterly called it Janus Squared, after Janus, the Roman god, who had two heads, one facing the old year and the facing the new year, and as there were four heads, Janus Squared. And the last photograph is of me. I think I was 75 at the time, but I had just getting my certificate to say that I'd completed the 4-year course for EFM, which stands for Education for Ministry, which, although is in the Anglican Church, goes across I understand, quite a number of denominations. And having got my lay license for ministry, we were encouraged to study further by either taking the diploma in Anglican Studies or studying at EFN, but were encouraged to extend our religious and background education for ministry in all sorts of ways, whether pastoral or New or Old Testament or any other studies. I made this video with the help of my sister Deborah Williams for the use of my family or anybody else who might be interested in my life.